It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the park was alive with laughter, the crunch of leaves, and the warmth of families enjoying the last days before winter set in. Oliver, a dedicated single father, had planned this day for weeks. Between his demanding job and the responsibilities that came with raising his young daughter, Emily, time for a day off was rare, and he cherished every second they could spend together. Emily, a bubbly 6-year-old with bright eyes and an infectious laugh, had been waiting all week to visit the park, her favorite place to play on the swings and chase butterflies. Oliver, who had adopted her as a toddler, adored her with a fierceness that only grew each year. She was his entire world. As the afternoon sun started to dip, casting a golden glow over the park, Oliver gave Emily a gentle push on the swing. Her laughter rang out as she soared through the air, and he couldn't help but grin, his heart full, his worries forgotten, if only for a moment. To any passerby, they were simply a father and daughter enjoying a perfect day. But not everyone saw it that way. A few yards away, a woman named Marla sat on a park bench, sipping her coffee and glancing around the park with a scrutinizing eye. A long-time resident of the neighborhood, Marla often prided herself on keeping an eye out for suspicious behavior, convinced that her vigilance kept the area safe. Her gaze fell on Oliver and Emily, and she felt a twinge of unease. To her, something seemed off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the sight of a black man with a young white girl struck her as unusual. Instead of shrugging it off, her mind began to race with assumptions and suspicions. Her hands clutched her phone as she kept watching, her thoughts twisting into something darker. Oliver, oblivious to the watchful gaze, was helping Emily down from the swing, ready to lead her to the nearby slide when he noticed 2 police officers approaching from the path. Confused, he glanced around, wondering if there had been some kind of incident. His stomach tightened when he realized they were heading straight toward him. The officers, though polite, were guarded, their eyes darting from him to Emily as they asked to speak with him privately. In a heartbeat, his world shifted from carefree to tense. "Sir, we received a call about a possible kidnapping," one officer said cautiously, glancing at Emily. "Could you please explain your relationship to this child?" Oliver felt a shock of disbelief. A kidnapping. He looked down at Emily, who was gripping his hand, her face full of confusion. Taking a deep breath, he responded, "This is my daughter. I'm her father." One officer's brow furrowed. "Can we see some ID?" Oliver fumbled through his wallet, handing over his driver's license, his heart pounding. Emily clung closer to him, sensing the tension. His mind raced, filled with a sense of disbelief and anger. He had raised Emily since she was a baby, had fought for her, loved her, and now he was being questioned in front of his daughter, as though he were a criminal. Meanwhile, Marla sat from her vantage point, watching the scene unfold, feeling the strange satisfaction that her suspicions had been taken seriously. She had expected some kind of validation, a confirmation of her fears, but now that the confrontation was happening, an odd sense of guilt started to creep into her chest. Still, she justified her actions internally, convinced that she had done the right thing by calling the police. As the officers checked Oliver's ID, a small crowd began to gather. Some whispered among themselves, glancing at the scene with curiosity, while others looked on with concern. A few recognized Oliver and Emily, and their faces showed expressions of confusion and anger. A woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. "I know this man. He's Emily's father. They come here all the time," she declared, crossing her arms defiantly. Her statement was a ripple in the crowd, and a few others nodded, murmuring in agreement. One of the officers glanced around, appearing slightly uncomfortable with the public scrutiny. He turned back to Oliver, handing him his ID with an awkward apology, but the damage was done. Oliver, his face a mix of frustration and sadness, looked down at his daughter, who seemed on the verge of tears. Kneeling, he wrapped his arms around her, comforting her as best as he could. But how could he explain this to her? How could he tell her that some people would always see him as a threat, as someone suspicious, even when he was simply being her dad. As the officers began to step away, Marla stood, realizing the attention was now shifting toward her. People were looking, whispers growing louder, and she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had been so certain that she was doing the right thing, that her vigilance was justified. But now, with so many eyes on her, she felt exposed, vulnerable, and incredibly small. Oliver, still holding Emily, stood up and caught Marla's eye. She flinched under his gaze, seeing the hurt and anger there, emotions that were unmistakable even from across the park. It was then that she realized the enormity of what she had done. She had intruded on a father's simple day with his daughter, turned it into a nightmare. And for what? Because of an assumption, a fleeting thought that had spiraled out of control. As Oliver gathered Emily and walked away, heads turned toward Marla, judgment in their eyes. And as she stood alone on the park bench, she felt a profound isolation, a sense of shame that she couldn't shake. She realized, in that moment, that this wasn't going to be something she could just brush off or forget. This was only the beginning of the consequences that would follow her. That night, Marla couldn't sleep. The faces in the crowd, the anger in Oliver's eyes, and the sound of Emily's quiet sobs as she clung to her father echoed in her mind. She had crossed a line, and now she would have to live with what she had done. The community would not forget, and neither would Oliver and Emily. The ripple she had started that day was only beginning to make its way through their small town, leaving her wondering what more she would lose as the truth of her actions spread. The echoes of the previous day's incident continued to ripple through Oliver's mind as he went about his evening, doing his best to put on a brave face for Emily. She was still a little shaken, though she tried to be her usual cheerful self, asking questions about the policemen and why they had come to the park. Oliver, unsure how much to tell her, simply said they were just being careful, but his heart ached, knowing that this would be something she'd likely remember for a long time. The weight of the day stayed with him, lingering like a heavy shadow over what should have been a cherished memory. The next morning, the incident was the talk of the town. News traveled fast in their small community, and while most of the details were distorted, everyone seemed to have their version of what had happened. Some were outraged, others confused, and a few whispered in hushed tones that maybe the woman had only been acting out of caution. But for Oliver, it wasn't just a story. It was a reality he'd faced and would likely face again. A stark reminder of the biases people held, even when they didn't know him or his daughter. That day, he was more careful about where he went with Emily, second-guessing places he would have usually visited without a thought. As he walked down the main street, he noticed a few people glancing his way, some with sympathetic looks, others with curiosity, and a handful with a quiet judgment that was all too familiar. Every stare was a reminder of the assumptions people could make, a painful realization that, for some, the bond he shared with his daughter would always be questioned. It stung more than he'd admit, and for the first time, he felt the weight of isolation in his own town, a place that was supposed to feel like home. Meanwhile, Marla couldn't ignore the growing whispers either. Friends who had once chatted with her freely now seemed wary, their conversations filled with strained politeness. She felt a sense of embarrassment that she couldn't quite shake, and when she went to her usual coffee shop, the barista barely made eye contact, handing her coffee without a word. It was subtle, but she knew it wasn't her imagination. People were beginning to judge her, to look at her as though she had done something unforgivable. In her mind, she tried to justify her actions, repeating to herself that she was just trying to protect the community, that she was acting out of genuine concern. But deep down, she knew that was only part of the truth. She had reacted out of fear, out of prejudice, and now that the consequences were catching up to her, she was starting to realize the damage she'd caused. Her husband, Tom, noticed her troubled demeanor that evening as she sat quietly at the dinner table, barely touching her food. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Marla hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. Would he understand? Or would he too, Look at her with that same mixture of judgment and pity that she was beginning to see everywhere else. I made a mistake," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Tom looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, setting his fork down, his attention fully on her now. Marla took a deep breath, recounting the events at the park, each detail seeming worse than the last as she spoke them aloud. Tom listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but she could sense his disappointment, and it stung more than she'd expected. When she finished, he looked down, his face filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Marla, do you realize what you've done? That man, he's just a father, like any other, trying to raise his daughter. And now you've turned his life upside down because you couldn't see past whatever you thought you saw." His words cut deeper than any glare she'd received, and for a moment she was left speechless. "I was just trying to help," she murmured weakly, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. Tom shook his head, sighing heavily. "You didn't help anyone. You only made things worse, for him, for his daughter, and now for yourself." He stood up, the scrape of his chair loud in the silent room. "I don't know what to say, Marla. I thought you were better than this." As he left the room, Marla felt a wave of shame wash over her, the realization settling in that her actions had impacted more than just a stranger in the park. She had hurt her family, her reputation, and perhaps even her own understanding of herself. The person she had always believed herself to be, a compassionate, fair-minded member of her community, was now clouded by the actions she couldn't take back. Days passed, and while Marla tried to resume her normal routine, the weight of her actions followed her like a shadow. She avoided certain places, the places where she knew people would stare, would whisper. It was a small town, and she could feel her reputation slipping, one sideways glance at a time. People who had once waved at her on the street now looked away, and some even crossed to the other side of the road. She couldn't escape the judgment that lingered in every corner of her life. She began to withdraw, isolating herself from the community she had once felt proud to protect. Oliver, on the other hand, was experiencing a different kind of transformation. The incident had left a mark, but instead of retreating, he found himself becoming more involved, determined to make a difference. He attended community meetings, sharing his story with a quiet dignity that resonated with many who heard him. He spoke about the importance of understanding, of seeing people for who they were rather than the assumptions placed upon them. Slowly, people began to see him not just as the victim of a misunderstanding, but as a voice of change, someone who was willing to use his experience to build a bridge of understanding. Emily, too young to grasp the full weight of the incident, still sensed a shift in her father. She noticed how he spoke with more people, how strangers would stop him, offering words of support, some even apologizing for the way he'd been treated. And while she didn't understand it all, she knew her dad was doing something important, something that was helping others. Marla's world, meanwhile, continued to unravel. The isolation she felt grew unbearable, and she found herself replaying that day over and over, each memory more painful than the last. The friends she had once confided in seemed distant, their trust eroded by her actions. She tried reaching out, but most conversations were met with forced politeness, or worse, an uncomfortable silence that spoke louder than words. She had become, in many ways, an outsider in her own town. It wasn't until she saw a flyer for an upcoming community meeting, where Oliver was scheduled to speak, that she felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Guilt. True, raw guilt that gnawed at her, reminding her of the damage she'd caused, the pain she'd inflicted not only on Oliver and his daughter, but on herself and her family. She knew that attending would mean facing the very people who had turned their backs on her, the people who now saw her as a symbol of everything wrong in their community. But she also knew that hiding from it wasn't going to change anything. That evening, Marla made a decision. She would go to the meeting, no matter how hard it would be, no matter how much shame she'd have to endure. Because if there was any hope of making things right, of atoning for what she'd done. It would start there, in that room, facing the people she had hurt, facing herself. The night of the community meeting arrived, and the tension was palpable. It was rare for such a small town to have this kind of turnout. The community center was packed, with rows of chairs set out hastily as people filled every corner of the room. News of Oliver's experience had spread far beyond the small circle it had initially impacted, resonating with people who had faced similar challenges or felt strongly about the incident. The air buzzed with anticipation, conversations humming with a mixture of anger, sympathy, and curiosity. As people settled in, many were surprised to see Marla slip quietly into the back of the room. Her face was pale, her usual confident demeanor replaced with a look of vulnerability that seemed foreign to anyone who knew her. She sat alone, her hands twisting in her lap, as she avoided eye contact with everyone, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. At the front of the room, Oliver sat with Emily beside him, the warmth of her small hand in his giving him the strength he needed. He had spent days preparing for this moment, gathering his thoughts and rehearsing what he wanted to say. The incident had shaken him, and he still felt the sting of the humiliation he had faced in front of his daughter and his community. But he also understood that his story had sparked something important, a conversation that went beyond him and Emily. He wasn't just here to share what had happened. He was here to change minds, to build understanding, and to create a place where his daughter would grow up feeling safe and accepted. The meeting began, with the town council addressing the recent events and introducing Oliver as a guest speaker. As he rose to speak, the room fell silent. Every eye turned to him, each person leaning in, eager to hear his words. He started by thanking everyone for coming, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke about his journey as a father, the joy he felt in raising Emily, and the challenges he had faced in a world that sometimes looked at them with suspicion simply because they looked different. He shared, in painstaking detail, what it had felt like to be approached by the police that day in the park, the shock, the fear, and most of all, the sadness that his presence as a black man with a white child had caused someone to call the authorities. The crowd listened, rapt and silent, as Oliver poured his heart out, describing the unfairness of that day and the impact it had on his relationship with Emily. He recounted her confusion, her innocent questions, and the struggle he faced in trying to explain something so complex to a young child. "How do I tell my daughter?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, "that people may look at us and make assumptions, that some will see her as mine and others as a question mark." His words struck a chord, and several members of the audience dabbed at their eyes, touched by the raw honesty of his experience. As he spoke, Marla felt each word as a sharp pang in her heart. She realized that this wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a deeply personal wound she had inflicted on a family. She saw Oliver not as a stranger, but as a person who had suffered because of her fears, her biases. She wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating guilt that wrapped around her, but something rooted her in place, forcing her to face the pain she had caused. Oliver continued, sharing how the experience had left him feeling like a stranger in his own community, how he had grappled with the decision of whether to stay in a town where he felt his daughter might grow up under the same shadow of suspicion. "But I want to believe this place can be better," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I want to believe that we can build a community where people look out for each other, where they see a father with his daughter, and just see love, not danger." As he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, a wave of support and appreciation that left Oliver momentarily overwhelmed. People rose to their feet, clapping with a fervor that echoed throughout the room. It was a powerful show of solidarity, a statement that resonated deeply with those who had come to listen, and even those who may have held their own biases before. After the applause died down, a few people took turns speaking. Many shared personal stories of their own experiences with discrimination, some painfully recounting moments from their past that they had never shared publicly before. It was as though Oliver's courage had unlocked something in the room, giving others the strength to confront their own truths. A woman described how she had once been followed around a store, suspected of shoplifting simply because of her skin color. A man recounted his family's experience of being the only black family in a neighborhood and the isolation they had felt. Each story added a layer to the evening, deepening the conversation and widening the lens through which everyone saw the world. Then, to everyone's surprise, Marla stood up. Her legs felt shaky as she made her way to the front of the room. The eyes of the audience fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and, for some, disdain. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she faced the room, and especially Oliver, who looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper at first. I don't know where to start," she stammered, her cheeks flushed with shame. "I made a terrible mistake. I saw something that wasn't there, and I let my fear, my own biases, cloud my judgment. I can't change what I did, and I can't undo the hurt I caused. But I am deeply, deeply sorry." Her voice broke, and she paused, struggling to regain her composure. "I thought I was protecting this community, but I see now that I was only protecting my own comfort, my own ignorance. I didn't see Oliver as a father. I saw him through a lens of fear. And for that, I am truly sorry." There was a heavy silence as Marla's words hung in the air. Some members of the audience looked moved, others skeptical, but no one spoke. Oliver remained silent, his expression thoughtful but guarded. Marla felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never felt before. She had always been a proud woman, convinced of her own righteousness, but tonight she felt humbled, stripped of the illusions she had built around herself. She wanted forgiveness, but she knew it wasn't something she could demand. It had to be earned. After a long pause, Oliver finally rose to his feet, his gaze steady as he looked at her. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. His words were simple, but there was a strength in them that resonated. He didn't forgive her, not yet, and he didn't offer her any absolution, but his acknowledgement of her apology was a start. It was a step toward healing, not just for him and his family, but for the community as a whole. As the meeting drew to a close, the town council proposed a new initiative. Regular discussions and workshops focused on diversity, inclusion, and understanding to help the community address its biases and create a safer, more welcoming environment for everyone. The crowd reacted positively, many expressing their willingness to participate and support the effort. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a subtle but powerful change that hinted at the possibility of a new beginning. When the meeting ended, Marla left quietly, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering shame. She knew she had a long way to go, that one apology didn't erase the pain she'd caused. But as she walked home that night, she felt something she hadn't felt in days, a sliver of hope. Hope that maybe she could begin to make amends, not just with Oliver and the community, but with herself. Oliver walked home with Emily, who had fallen asleep in his arms. He felt exhausted, but there was a quiet sense of victory in his heart. The journey was far from over, and there would be more difficult conversations, more barriers to break down. But tonight, he had taken a stand, not just for himself and Emily, but for every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety. And as he held his daughter close, he knew he was no longer alone in this fight. The community had heard him, and maybe, just maybe, they were ready to change. The days following the community meeting were a whirlwind of mixed emotions for everyone involved. For Oliver, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The meeting had been a rare moment of openness, and he could feel that it had left an impact. He noticed small but telling changes in the way people interacted with him. Neighbors who had once only nodded politely now stopped to chat, asking about Emily or offering words of support. Even strangers he'd never spoken to before would give him a smile or a quick, "Hey, I saw you at the meeting." That took courage. For the first time in a long time, Oliver felt a sense of belonging. He wasn't just a face in the crowd anymore. People recognized him, saw him, and he could feel that their perceptions were beginning to shift. But the change didn't come without challenges. Oliver and Emily became the talk of the town in ways that weren't always comfortable. He'd catch snippets of conversations in the grocery store or the coffee shop, people discussing his story, his family, his experiences. Most of it was positive, but occasionally he'd hear someone question why he had to make such a big deal out of it, or express frustration over the growing focus on racial issues in the town. It hurt to hear those words, and he struggled with the idea that there would always be people who wouldn't understand, who would cling to their biases despite everything. Emily, too, was affected by the attention. Though she didn't fully grasp the weight of what had happened, she sensed that people looked at them differently now. At school, other children sometimes asked her questions she didn't know how to answer. Why did the police come to the park? Did your dad do something bad? The innocence in their questions made it harder for Oliver to explain, and he found himself carefully navigating these conversations with Emily, trying to preserve her innocence while also preparing her for the reality they lived in. He told her that sometimes people didn't understand things, that sometimes they made mistakes, and that they were working to make sure it wouldn't happen again. He didn't tell her about Marla's apology, or the struggle he felt in his heart as he tried to let go of his resentment toward her. That was a journey he would have to face alone. Marla, meanwhile, was enduring a far more isolating experience. The public apology at the meeting had been a moment of reckoning, but it hadn't erased the judgment she felt from her neighbors, or the distance she now sensed even from her own friends. People she had known for years suddenly looked at her differently, and each day felt like a test of her resilience. She would run into acquaintances at the market, and they would offer a tight smile, or worse, avoid her altogether. Her own family struggled to understand the enormity of what she'd done. Her daughter, who was in high school, stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed by the stigma her mother now carried. Her husband, Tom, was supportive in his way, but he had quietly withdrawn, choosing not to speak of the incident unless she brought it up. There was a rift in her home, a silence that had settled over her family, and she felt it widening with each passing day. One afternoon, in a moment of desperation, Marla decided to reach out to Oliver. She knew it was risky, that he might not even want to speak to her, but she couldn't shake the need to make things right, or at least try to. She thought long and hard before finally sending a message, a simple request to meet, not at his house or a public place, but somewhere neutral, somewhere that wouldn't draw attention. To her surprise, he agreed, though his response was brief, and she could sense the hesitation in his words. They met at a small cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. Marla arrived first, her nerves frayed, her mind racing with what she wanted to say, with how she would even begin to explain herself. When Oliver walked in, he looked around briefly before spotting her, his expression guarded but polite. He took a seat across from her, folding his hands on the table, and waited, giving her the floor. Marla took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she began. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused, searching for the right words, but everything she had rehearsed sounded hollow now, inadequate for the depth of what she needed to convey. "I know that what I did, there's no excuse. I hurt you and your daughter, and I've thought about that every day since. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that." Oliver listened silently, his face unreadable. When she finished, he took a moment, his gaze steady as he regarded her. "You know, Marla," he began slowly, "I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why you did what you did, trying to see if there was something I could have done differently, if there was something about me that made you think I didn't belong in that park with my daughter." His voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength in it, a firmness that made Marla's guilt swell even more. She shook her head, her eyes downcast. "It wasn't you. It was me. My own fears, my own ignorance. I didn't see you for who you were. I let my assumptions blind me, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Oliver sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But an apology doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't change the fact that my daughter was scared, that I had to explain things to her that I never wanted her to experience. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but you need to understand that the damage runs deeper than a single moment." Marla nodded, her throat tight as she tried to hold back tears. I know it doesn't change anything, but I want to help, to do something to make amends, to make sure this doesn't happen again to anyone else." She looked at him, pleading with her eyes. "If there's anything I can do, please, let me know." Oliver considered her offer, and for the first time, he saw a genuine sincerity in her that hadn't been there before. He nodded slowly. "I don't know what you can do, Marla, but maybe if you start with listening, with understanding, that's a place to begin. Change doesn't happen overnight, and trust isn't something you can demand. You have to earn it, one small step at a time." They sat in silence after that, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Oliver knew that forgiving Marla wouldn't be easy, that it might never fully happen, but he could see the remorse in her, the willingness to grow and learn. And for him, that was a start. As they left the cafe, each went their separate way. But a shift had occurred. Marla returned home with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to find a way to make things right. She began attending community workshops, listening to stories of others who had experienced similar biases, absorbing their experiences with a humility that was new to her. She joined local initiatives focused on creating awareness, volunteering her time to promote understanding and equality. Slowly, people began to notice her efforts, to see that she was not just offering empty words, but was committed to real change. Oliver, too, continued his own journey. He became a prominent voice in the community, advocating for diversity training in schools and workplaces, speaking at events, and sharing his story with a quiet determination. Emily grew up watching her father's resilience, learning from his strength, and absorbing the lessons he imparted about love, empathy, and the courage to stand up for what was right. Together, they navigated a world that wasn't always kind, but they did so with a sense of purpose, knowing that their experiences had the power to shape the community for the better. Months passed, and though the scars of that day in the park remained, they no longer defined Oliver or Marla. Their lives had become intertwined in a way neither could have foreseen, each shaped by the encounter that had brought them both pain and growth. And as the community continued to evolve, it became a place that was a little more inclusive, a little more aware, and a little more compassionate. Months turned into a year, and while the memory of that day in the park had softened, its effects lingered, shaping the lives of both Oliver and Marla in ways they hadn't anticipated. Oliver had continued his journey as an advocate for understanding and unity within the community, but his role had grown far beyond what he ever imagined. He was invited to speak not only at local events, but at neighboring towns, schools, and even online webinars. His story had resonated deeply, and people were eager to listen, to learn, and to confront their own biases. Each time he spoke, he felt a blend of vulnerability and strength, as if he was simultaneously confronting old wounds and healing them through the act of sharing. The community had undergone a transformation too, albeit a gradual one. The workshops that had started as a response to the incident became a monthly tradition, drawing people from all walks of life who were ready to listen, share, and reflect. Local businesses had adopted diversity training programs, the schools implemented lessons that celebrated differences, and a community-wide celebration was established to honor the town's rich tapestry of cultures and backgrounds. The town council had even created a diversity advisory board, with Oliver as its chair, a role that both humbled and challenged him. His days were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and endless discussions, but each one felt purposeful, like he was part of something bigger than himself. Emily, now a year older, had blossomed in her own right. She had taken to heart her father's lessons, proudly telling friends about her family, her experiences, and even her small role in what had become a turning point for their town. Her classmates, once curious or confused about the incident, now saw her as a symbol of resilience and openness. Emily herself was still young and sometimes struggled to grasp the complexity of the situation, but she knew her father's work mattered, and she was proud of him. They had become a team, a pair bonded even closer by their shared journey, and Oliver often marveled at the strength Emily displayed, even as a child. She would occasionally ask about Marla, curious about the woman who had sparked this chain of events, and Oliver, after much thought, chose to tell her about the steps Marla had taken to make amends. Meanwhile, Marla's life had changed drastically. The social isolation she experienced after that fateful day had transformed into a period of intense self-reflection and rebuilding. Her days were now filled with volunteer work, not just as a form of atonement, but as a genuine effort to contribute positively to her community. She had become a familiar face at the workshops and a vocal supporter of initiatives that fostered inclusion. She had even taken on the role of an organizer, reaching out to people who had experienced bias and giving them a platform to share their stories. It was a humbling experience, one that forced her to confront her own misconceptions repeatedly, but it also became a source of fulfillment and a way for her to redefine her place in the town. One day, as Marla was helping set up a community event focused on celebrating cultural diversity, she noticed Oliver and Emily arrive. It was the first time they'd been in the same space outside of the cafe meeting months ago, and her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't spoken to him since then, although she had been following his work, admiring the quiet strength he exhibited as he helped reshape their community. She felt a surge of gratitude toward him, knowing that without his forgiveness, or at least his tolerance of her presence, she wouldn't have been able to make the progress she had. Oliver noticed her too, and their eyes met briefly. Marla offered a small, tentative smile, and he returned it with a nod. It wasn't an invitation to talk, nor was it an acknowledgement of friendship, but it was something, an understanding, perhaps, that they had each played a role in creating the community they were now proud to be part of. It was enough for Marla, who felt a sense of peace as she continued with her work, grateful for this quiet reconciliation that didn't need words to be felt. The event that day was a powerful display of unity. Local musicians played songs from various cultures, food stalls offered dishes from around the world, and children performed dances and skits that celebrated diversity. Oliver had helped plan the event, and he watched with pride as people mingled, laughed, and shared stories, each one a testament to the progress they'd made as a community. He felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that he and Emily, and even Marla, had contributed to this atmosphere of acceptance. As the evening wound down, Oliver was asked to give a closing speech. He hadn't planned anything specific, but he stood in front of the crowd, feeling the weight of their shared journey, the collective growth that had brought them all together. He spoke from the heart, thanking everyone for their openness, their willingness to change, and the courage they'd shown in facing their own biases. He emphasized the importance of continuing this work, of making sure that their progress didn't end with one event or one story. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice carrying over the attentive crowd, "but there's always more work to do. Let's keep moving forward, together, and let's make this a place where everyone feels they belong." The crowd erupted into applause, and Oliver felt a rush of emotion, a culmination of everything he'd endured and everything he'd achieved. He looked over at Emily, who was clapping enthusiastically, her face beaming with pride. And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace. They had taken something painful and turned it into something beautiful, something lasting. After the event, as people began to disperse, Marla approached Oliver cautiously. She still felt a sense of trepidation around him, knowing the depth of the pain she had caused, but she also felt compelled to acknowledge him, to thank him. When she reached him, she extended her hand. "Thank you, Oliver," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "For everything. I can't tell you how much I've learned from you." Oliver looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. He took her hand, giving it a firm shake. "It's been a journey for both of us," he replied simply. He didn't elaborate, but his tone carried an understanding, a quiet acceptance that didn't need to be spoken. He knew that forgiveness was a process, one that took time and reflection, but he also knew that Marla had changed, and that in itself was a testament to the power of growth and reconciliation. As they parted ways, both felt a sense of closure, a feeling that they had each done their part in healing the wounds of the past. For Oliver, it was a reminder of the strength that lay in forgiveness, in choosing to see beyond a single moment and recognize the potential for change in others. For Marla, it was a moment of redemption, a chance to continue on her path with a renewed sense of purpose and humility. The community, too, felt the ripple effects of their journey. The town that had once been marked by division and misunderstanding had transformed into a place of unity, a community that celebrated its diversity and supported its members, no matter their background. The workshops, the events, the initiatives, they became a legacy, a reminder that change was possible when people were willing to listen, to learn, and to grow. And though Oliver knew that their journey was far from over, that there would always be challenges to face, he felt a profound sense of hope. Together, they had shown that even the most painful experiences could become a catalyst for something beautiful, a force that could bring people together and create a place where everyone belonged. As he walked home that evening, Emily's small hand in his, he felt a lightness in his heart, knowing that they were part of something bigger, something that would continue long after them. It was a quiet, lasting victory, one that would shape not only their lives but the lives of generations to come. A few years passed, and the town continued to evolve, its culture enriched by the legacy of that unforgettable event and the tireless efforts of those who had sparked change. Oliver had become a well-respected figure not only within his town, but in nearby communities as well, frequently invited to speak on topics of unity, resilience, and the power of understanding. His story, once a painful personal experience, had become a beacon of hope and transformation, an example of how individuals could inspire change by choosing empathy over resentment. Oliver's role had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. He had taken on a mentorship role within the community, working closely with local schools to implement programs that promoted inclusion and empathy from a young age. He led workshops for teachers, administrators, and even the police force, bridging gaps that once seemed insurmountable. His voice became a trusted one, a voice that people respected and looked to for guidance. He wasn't just an advocate. He had become a symbol of the town's journey toward a better, more understanding future. Emily, now a teenager, had grown into a confident, compassionate young woman, carrying the lessons she had learned from her father with pride. The memory of that day in the park was a faint one now, but it had shaken her deeply. She was known for her kindness, her willingness to stand up for others, and her ability to bring people together. Her father's journey had become her own, and she often accompanied him to his events, speaking alongside him and sharing her perspective. She was a natural at it, her words resonating with both kids and adults, and she had become a beloved figure among her peers who admired her bravery and openness. One day, the town council reached out to Oliver with a proposal. They wanted to establish an annual Day of Unity, a day dedicated to celebrating diversity, inclusion, and understanding, with events, speakers, and activities that would bring the community together. They asked Oliver to be the honorary chair of the event, a role he accepted with pride and gratitude. Planning began in earnest, with community members, businesses, schools, and local leaders all coming together to create something that would honor the progress they had made and serve as a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. On the first day of Unity, the town was transformed. Streets were adorned with banners celebrating different cultures, and stalls lined the main square, each one showcasing art, food, music, and traditions from various backgrounds. Children ran from stall to stall, trying foods they'd never tasted before, watching traditional dances, and listening to stories told by elders who had immigrated from far-off places. The air was filled with laughter, the mingling of languages, and the hum of music from every corner of the world. As part of the event, a stage had been set up in the center of town, where speakers and performers took turns throughout the day. Oliver and Emily were scheduled to speak in the evening, the final of the day's celebrations. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the crowd, people gathered around the stage, waiting in anticipation. Marla, who had helped organize the event, stood among them, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Over the years, she had become a close friend to Oliver, her journey one of redemption and renewal. She had rebuilt her life, her reputation, and her relationships within the town, earning back the trust she had once lost. When Oliver and Emily took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. Oliver began by thanking everyone for their dedication, their willingness to grow, and their commitment to making the town a place where everyone could feel at home. He spoke of the early days, of the struggles, the misunderstandings, and the difficult conversations they had endured, all leading to this moment of unity. "This day isn't just a celebration," he said, his voice carrying over the attentive crowd. "It's a reminder of the strength we find in our differences, of the beauty that comes when we listen to each other, when we see each other fully without judgment. This is what community is." Emily stepped forward, her voice steady and clear as she shared her perspective. She spoke about the journey her family had taken, the support they had found, and the growth they had witnessed in their town. She addressed her peers, encouraging them to continue the work of understanding, to carry on the legacy of empathy that had become a cornerstone of their community. "We all have a part to play," she said. "It doesn't matter how young or old we are, where we come from, or what we look like. What matters is how we treat each other, how we choose to make each person feel seen and valued." As they finished their speeches, the crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation that filled the square with a sense of warmth and unity. Marla, wiping tears from her eyes, joined in the applause, feeling the weight of the years lift from her shoulders. She knew she had made mistakes, but she also knew that she had played a part, however small, in helping to create this moment. And as she looked around at the faces of her neighbors, friends, and family, she felt a deep sense of peace. The celebration continued late into the night, with music, dancing, and laughter filling the streets. People mingled, sharing stories, reconnecting with old friends, and making new ones. It was a night that would be remembered for years to come, a night that symbolized the heart of a community that had chosen unity over division, empathy over prejudice. As the festivities wound down, Oliver found himself standing at the edge of the square, looking out over the crowd with a quiet smile. Emily joined him, her hand slipping into his. They stood together, father and daughter, their bond stronger than ever, their journey one that had not only shaped their lives, but had left an indelible mark on the town they called home. Turning to her father, Emily asked, "Do you think we'll ever have to go through something like that day in the park again?" Oliver thought for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "I hope not," he replied softly. "But even if we do, I know we're stronger now. We're ready to face it, together, with the support of a community that has learned the importance of standing by each other." As they walked home under the stars, Oliver felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that while the path they had walked was difficult, it had brought them to a place of understanding, of unity, and of love. And he knew that the legacy of this journey would live on in Emily, in their town, and in every life they had touched along the way. It was a legacy of resilience, of transformation, and of the unbreakable bond that formed when a community came together to support, uplift, and truly see one another.